Hello, everyone. Welcome to meeting 55, June 21st. Glad to have you. Let's see. I want to throw a message real quick in Slack. I kind of threw one already, but all right. Recording is going great. New faces. I don't see any new faces. Everybody's old faces. Awesome. And code of conduct, if you're watching this from the recording or in the future, you haven't joined us before, welcome. We have a code of conduct. Please check out the recording Zoom Slack. I think that's a thing. I just posted the agenda notes and there's a link in there to our code of conduct. All right. Kicking off show and tell items. We don't have anything on the agenda. Anybody have anything they want to bring up ad hoc? All right. No worries. We can come back to that too if anybody wants to. All right, let's jump into topics. Chris, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I just had a bit of an ask, I guess. I'm not necessarily expecting responses now, but I think Rufio, when we were developing it initially, we kind of realized that there's going to be collisions between some of the types in that there's one type that tries to bring about, or the original design was there's one type to bring about desired state, which complements the Kubernetes approach. And then the second aspect to that is that you can fire off one-off jobs and have it go ahead and do a thing. But in those two things collide in the Kubernetes world, because if you have something trying to bring about desired state and something then trying to do one-off actions, the desired state just goes ahead and they're just going to be bouncing off each other, and it's not great. So what we did temporarily is make one of them read-only, the baseboard management type, so you can read the existing state of the machine and then use jobs to enact write operations. But my question is really just, it'd be great if maybe we need a doc or an issue for this so that people can contribute on, or a discussion in GitHub, but it would be great if we could brainstorm some use cases to try and better understand what we want out of the project, because it may influence, whether or not we even keep the baseboard management type, and whether we actually have a desired state thing, or if we just roll with job-based stuff. I know that there was interest from one person who was raising some issues and some PRs to fix the issues on the baseboard management type, and I just commented on it to say we're not sure if we really want to keep this. So anyway, it just triggered me to think it'd be great if I could get feedback from people as and when. If you have some ideas now that you wanted to mention, great, but I'll put a discussion in the GitHub as well.
So quick question, this is specifically this one CRD for baseboard management type, or are you just talking in general about all of them? Or
I think in general, like, as well, it's not necessarily specific to this type. It's more like, what do we want to actually achieve with Rufio? The conversation kind of came up in the last meet as well. I think Steve Wills was here, and he was, and Nahum were commenting about what we could do. And anyway, it's more general than that. I think my question is like, what are we trying to do? Because it would be good to it'd be good to work backwards from there and let that influence our APIs a little bit, if that makes sense. We have a use cases in EKSA, for example, but there's clearly other use cases because somebody else is trying to use it in the Harvester project in HashiCorp. So, and they seem to want the baseboard management type, but we were thinking about maybe not having write APIs on that, but clearly there might be a demand for that. So this is more let's try and gather some information and see if we can use that to help influence the design a little bit. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
The clearest example of how I would imagine like the conflict is in a power cycling event, right? Yep. Like you have something that says the machine should be powered on, so the current state is trying to perpetuate as the machine should be on, and then you're trying to like trigger a reboot to kick off like maybe a deprovision or a provision or whatever it is. And so that thing says, oh, the power state should be reset, or the power state, which is like different than on, or you send in like, oh, tell it to power off, but the current desired state is on. So it's going to say, why would I send a power off if the desired state is on? I guess
that's exactly what we hit.
Right. Is there a way for, and again, I haven't looked at the code. I don't have that context. I'm just from a conceptual level though. Is there like I could imagine like the rough idea I came up with while you were talking was, okay, the desired state is on, but if a job comes in saying turn it off, that job is allowed to issue a power off, so that on whatever the next, I imagine that this software is like running, like there is some sort of timer somewhere that's going to like check a thing and update the state and see, oh, is it correct or is it wrong? If there's a way for a job to come in and override whatever the current desired state is, you could send a power off, at which point the next clock cycle, it would see, oh, it's off, I'm going to turn it back on again. And that would affect a reboot. It's not as nice as a warm reset if that's the thing you really want, having to issue a power off versus whatever. But again, similarly, you could probably issue a reset, at which point, again, the next cycle that the thing is looking at, it's going to say, oh, it's on, but the reset command was allowed to go through. Is there a way to do that, or like am I misunderstanding the way that the software runs?
No, what you're describing is definitely an implementation and something we tried. You could like pause the baseboard management type, for example, while you're running a job, but you're starting to get into timing issues with that. So I guess, I want to make sure that we're heading the right direction before messing with that kind of problem space again. Because to your point, you could solve it with something like that. Jobs are funny in the Kubernetes world because they have a start and a finish, and it's pretty clear what they are, generally speaking. So once it finishes, what entity is responsible for then saying, okay, we need to resume baseboard management power action state stuff, for example? Is it the job? Is it the fact that the job ended? Or is it some other entity that decides to unpause that? Like the detail becomes a little bit flaky. And so before we start messing with that, I just want to make sure we establish a good understanding of what the use case is and that it is actually a demand, I guess.
Right. I guess. Go ahead.
Just another thought is in Terraform providers, and then that translates to cross-plane, where bare metal machines would be expressed as state, and there's a need to turn things on and off and reboot things. A way that I've contemplated doing it before, I haven't enacted it anywhere yet, is to translate those one-time RPC type actions into a timestamp. So you could say like rebooted since, or like last powered on since, and then that past date becomes that is truthy. That is the state. It was last turned on or last turned off at the certain date, or last rebooted at the certain state or date. And then you can confirm that through some sort of history to say, well, this was. Now reboot maybe becomes hard if there's no like log of every time a machine was rebooted. But if you can say like it was powered on or powered off at a certain date, then it also becomes difficult, I think, when you have competing states that you want to have. So if you say like it was powered on since, powered off since, rebooted since, those, you might have a hard time reconciling those three things against each other. But I'm just throwing that out there as another way to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that Jacob suggested, I think internally in Amazon a while ago, and I wonder if this is something to humor as well, is do we have higher levels of abstraction that we model? Like, I want to put a machine in a particular state, and are there common use cases that we can define within the Rufio project to define those higher level abstractions? But I just don't know the answer to those questions. So yeah, these are all good ideas.
I think there's a distinct, sorry, Naomi, go ahead.
So right, I'm very curious what Jacob has to say because it's probably very valuable. But I will forge ahead. So number one, a question about like, is Rufio running as a daemon and then Kubernetes is interacting with it? Is there like a single, I mean, is there sort of single source of truth at any given time that Kubernetes is talking to? But put a pin in that because this other thing might be more relevant. So the other day I was talking in the Slack channel about how like I'd love to do a proof of concept of like a netbox integration. And again, this gets back to my prior experience at a previous job using Collins, where there is a notion within Collins of like the state the machine is in. And like we had classically like our machine was like available, right? And then you could provision it, which would transition it to like there were a few different states of like provisioning started, provisioning like pending validation, fully provisioned, ready to do work. And there were different pieces of software that would have to do different things to get it to walk through those different transitions. I don't know, like, so in the model I had of like Tinkerbell plus Netbox, then I would have put Netbox as the owner of those states of what's the current state of the machine and being able to transition it. But I could similarly imagine having that be functionality exposed within Rufio, within sort of some of the functionality provided by Tinkerbell, where we could say like that the Tinkerbell project has this high level notion of a machine transitioning through certain states of like ready to like, I don't know, like because we have boot control potentially, and because we have the ability to like send it a workflow, you could imagine saying like it's in the not yet, it's like available sitting there doing nothing and its expected power state is on or off, or either way, whatever it is. And then like transitioning it through, we know it has booted up and it's booted into Tink Worker, and so it's recorded as being in a like ready to do things state. And then from there you could transition to a like send it a workflow state, and if the workflow succeeds, then it transitions to like that workflow completed, and if that workflow says like, yeah, it's ready to go for the customer or not, like reboot could send phone homes to something that could send a transition. I could see us adding that within the Tinkerbell project. So I've said a lot of stuff. I'm curious what Jacob had to say. I'm curious for Chris's thoughts. There's a lot going on in my head.
Just before Jacob says anything, sorry, Jacob, because I know you're going to think,
ahead.
just to clarify, what you said, Nahum, is the current train of thought. Let's provide the building blocks to model high, and then the thing that wants to consume Rufio and leverage its capabilities would define that high level state. But I guess my point is I don't want to table any I kind of want all trains of thoughts to be welcomed, and then we work from there.
One more before you, Jacob, hopping in.
Yeah,
just following
go
on
ahead.
sorry, jumping on the train here. Like what Nahum said, at a previous place where we had these same sort of concerns, we also modeled it in a state of what the machines could be. They could be on, they could be off, they could be flagged for like firmware upgrades, and then that was a secondary, we'll call it spec in this case. So some secondary specs is like, this is the firmware version that's always supposed to be applied. And then so if you put it in that state, it would reconcile that state. Kubernetes is not involved, but I'm describing it as though it was. And then it would reset itself back to the powered on state or the powered off state afterwards, kind of based on other settings as to what to do after the firmware is applied. And then there were other kind of like niche jobs that you might want to do. So how would that apply in the BMC world? Would there be like certain, I think this is kind of what you were getting at earlier, Chris, is like, are there just certain functions that it has to perform all the time that are universal that we could like build into spec, maybe independent of the on-off state?
Okay, I'm going to jump in before someone else does. I feel like a lot of this stuff can be solved already with workflows, and that's why workflows exist, and that they have that power. And you can have multiple workers for a single workflow, which would allow you to do power states before a machine actually booted up. So you could add in there to say, I have a workflow with the first action, right, is for this other worker that's already up and running that does power things, right? And so you can model that. I think one of the challenges that Rufio might be hitting is that we want declarative API. That's good. We want to define some behavior, whether that's what we currently have or something higher, like get me into a net booting state, et cetera. That's all good. The challenge is that Kubernetes has this idea of controllers. And this idea is that you keep going around. And I think there's that is the challenge, right? Marcus, you brought up a lot of ideas that were all declarative, right? And they all had the same general. You talked to even words like reconcile that weren't Kubernetes. But I think the difference here was these were like single runs, right? So more akin to a Kubernetes job than to a controller that needs to continually check the state and reconcile it, right? We're looking in the baseboard management world, just go do this thing and then I'm good and I'll tell you later what to do, right? Or I'll ask you to get into a different state later. And so I think maybe the controller idea within Kubernetes is the challenging part that maybe we reevaluate. And there is no controller. Everything's a job, maybe. I don't know, right? But that's what I would bring up for a discussion point.
These were controllers. They just weren't like Kubernetes. So when you set the state, something would read that
Continually
the machine was
check
not
it.
in the state it was supposed to be, and it would apply it. Yeah. So you had
I think,
yeah.
okay, that's fair. That model to me it presents lots of challenges around. Now you need something to orchestrate this controller to say, okay, get me to this state. Now you're done. Let me turn you off to another state. Like you're checking. Anyways, I would love to just see this kind of. You can still make these declarative. You can still say, get me into a certain desired state. It can still be reconciled, but it just happens and then it's done, right? And you can let that single loop maybe on itself iterate until it gets to that state. But once it is able to achieve that, maybe there's a flag that turns it off and says, okay, I've got you to that state. It took me 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 1 second, whatever it is. But now I'm not going to reconcile this anymore. Because baseboard management has that challenge, right? Where it's like, there's all this timing type ideas.
This is kind of where I'm going with use cases, because in the world of Tinkerbell, where the main goal is provisioning, right? You can imagine that jobs complement that pretty well. But in the world where you have something deployed to production, perhaps that's a bit different. Perhaps you do want a desired state model where you always want the machine on, and say something turns it off, I don't know, power outage or something. You've got this type in there that will try and turn it on again and try and get it on and get the node back up. So I'm curious if there's a space for both things in some capacity, and it's going to obviously be up to us to make sure they play nice. But I don't know, we'll see, I guess. But I like all of this. All of these ideas are great.
I personally think the use case should be around provisioning initially, and we don't worry about a production type state where it can just make sure a machine's on or something like that. I think there's value there, but in terms of machine provisioning, I don't know. And not only that, but I'll say that in my opinion, we shouldn't build too much into Rufio because actions are more flexible and you can do these in actions. I think, in my opinion, we should have just a bare minimum of things like getting a machine into a net booting state, maybe setting a boot device and maybe turning the machine off. And then you just call it a day. Something very basic to get the machine to run actions, because that's where the flexibility, in my opinion, lies.
The only gripe I have with actions is that it requires another machine, which I suppose you're always going to have an extra. No, you don't necessarily have to. Yeah, it's just that it requires another machine. Like the assumption is the cluster would be there and it's going to do something with the machine. But for you to do something with that other machine, you have to have another machine.
If you have
to
Kubernetes,
orchestrate it.
you have another machine, right? Like by definition, your Kubernetes cluster, like, I mean, the resources to have a worker that is capable of sending BMC commands are very low. Like that just seems like something that could be, you could have some pods running in your cluster that are workers that have the secrets, have access to the secrets to do all the privileged commands that you would
the
need
virtual
to do in
worker
those
thing.
workers. Right.
It
I
could
think that's what
be,
Jacob's talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could be
Yeah,
the Tink, whatever the Tink stack is running, it could be the same machine. When you say you need another machine, you're right. It just, you've got Tink stack and then you've got the machine you want provision. The other machine could just be the Tink stack. It could be a literal other machine as well, but, or a pod somewhere else, but it just can't be that one you're trying to provision, right?
I guess what I really mean is another instance of a Tink worker.
Right.
Right. And whether that's a physical machine or whether that's in the cluster as a pod or whatnot is orthogonal to the problem we're discussing, I guess. So yeah,
Right.
point taken.
Right.
have we actually built the support to have those other workers? Like, can we actually do that today? Like theoretically, we want to. I don't think we. Oh, do we have it? You're nodding.
Yeah, you can, I mean, I've not seen the exact manifest, but there is no reason you couldn't, we have a Tink worker container image and there's no reason it couldn't be run manually pointing to, and I've done that, run it manually pointing to Tink that wasn't on a bare metal server.
Have you, sorry, let me clarify. Have you written a workflow that does actions in two different workers?
Oh,
Where like
yeah.
worker A does a task and then worker B does a task and then worker A does a task and worker B does a task.
Not that much. I did
I
like A does a task and then B does a task.
That's close enough, I think. If you've done A and B both doing tasks within a single workflow, I think that's what I want, because in theory you could just add more tasks.
Yeah, didn't work, by the way.
Oh, okay. So you're right. So I don't. Yeah. So have we gotten it to work? Was the question. Because if we can do that, I think we might be missing functionality to make that work. And if we build that functionality and we get that working, I
Right.
think that opens up a lot. And then you could imagine for example, the sandbox coming with a privileged worker that you run as part of the sandbox that's sitting there with access to something, whether it's, I mean, you could, I don't know where we want to, I don't think we should be dictating how to store secrets, but you could imagine storing the secrets in some sort of, again, I don't think we're currently doing the sandbox in a Kubernetes cluster, but like if you were doing it in a Kubernetes cluster and you had a CRD for, or not a CRD, if you had secrets somehow, and then you could
Sure.
put some secrets there and you had
Right.
this extra Tink worker with access to the secrets in some clever way, you could imagine saying like, oh, and here's how to push your BMC credentials into the secret store. And then here's how to have a privileged worker issue a power command. And then the rest of the workflow happens. But we haven't
Right.
built that to be able to demo, to be able to then build on top of that.
Right. Let me, apologize. Let me clarify. I haven't run that exact scenario where you have a single task in a workflow that has multiple workers. I have done a single workflow with multiple tasks on different workers. That
Right,
one
that's
did
fine,
not
that's fine.
work.
It didn't work,
And
right?
I posted the link. I actually opened an issue on that. What I didn't test was a single task, multiple workers, but that's, yeah, I'll throw that
I
on
don't
my
think that's
list.
what I meant. I mean, it's just, all I want is like A does something, then B does something, and then A does
Right.
something and B does something. Like that's all
Right.
I
Right.
need. And whether it's, yeah, I think, not sure on the terminology, but as long as I can do the things in order, interleaved.
Yeah,
For
that's
the
fair.
BMC related issue that you're bringing up, I think it would be helpful to see what all of the things are that you're trying to solve so like have it written up as an issue or as a little design one pager kind of thing. But before we try to like solution everything, but on topic of solutioning, it's also possible to take templates to have this bare metal controller if it's going to be performing actions against that. Well, now I'm wondering if the controllers themselves should be treated as like hardware with workflows executed on them. Is it even possible? To what extent is it possible?
I apologize. Can you explain
Yeah,
that again?
so
I
if
don't
like
know
the
I'm following
controllers
what
are,
you're
if
saying.
the controllers are running OS or like, kernels, like to what extent can we just run actions against them? Or treat them like machines? Treat them as like independent hardware.
I'm still not tracking.
Which
I'm
controllers are you talking about? A controller that's running a kernel?
Yeah.
Like
a
the
bare metal controller
Rufio,
acting.
like, or just is like a generic Tinkerbell controller that we would write?
Thinking about, well, all right, yeah, let me rewind. I got trapped in my own thought there. if there are certain actions that you want to have take place, then in the state of a device, let's say we have the state, and I'm sort of modeling this back to what I was describing at a past place. But if we needed the machine to be powered on or off, so that's like powered : true. And we need to know that certain actions have been performed on it. Then we could say like executed, and then have like an array and say like template : foo, have like a since date maybe, and then have as many actions as as many templates described as needed. And then the controller that would reconcile something like this would say, is the thing powered or not? Yes or no. But also have all these things been executed. And if they haven't been executed, then perform those executions by, and that's where I started getting confused. Like, how is it going to execute a Tinkerbell workflow, a Tinkerbell template / workflow against a bare metal controller device, unless we could also treat those like hardwares. But we can't Tinkerbell a BMC, can we? Can't like.
I think I get what you're saying. You're trying to figure out, is there a way to define an API that like Rufio's controller could use to bring about desired state, but
execute actions too. And then I was thinking
by
in the
specifying
language
actions,
of,
yeah.
and I was thinking of in the language of Tinkerbell, which would be weird, but could also be possible for BMCs that are like essentially Linux boxes.
I'm going to be honest,
Can-
Marcus. I think that sounds more confusing to Jacob's idea.
I'm not tracking it fully. I feel like because the actions, if I'm understanding you right, I feel like actions can already do that to a certain measure, right? You can just define out what you want to happen. I
Yeah.
want powered on, and then I want additional things to go on. Well, that's just walk through. I mean, we have sequential actions that can happen now.
Can we execute the actions on the BMC?
No, because the BMC is not going to speak the Tinkerbell APIs and initiate a gRPC connection into Tink server. That's what Tink workers do. A Tink worker opens up a gRPC connection to Tink server and says, tell me what to do. So, I mean, in theory, could you like hack up OpenBMC and add Tink worker into it?
Right.
Maybe. That seems complicated, as opposed to like having something that speaks BMC running in your Kubernetes cluster, to which that is also speaking Tink worker, speaks like a Tink worker and says like, hey, what should I be doing? And it says, please tell the BMC to do the thing. And it says, oh, hey, BMC, please do power cycle, which is what Jacob was describing.
Yeah. And that's that long maybe is what I was thinking, like, could you actually run Tink worker on those machines? But yeah, if you just the same thing, but take away the template and replace it with those simple actions and just say, this is a list of actions that I want to have expressed by certain dates. And then you could just, if you want those actions run again, just update the dates.
I mean, I think
dates. Sorry, go ahead, Micah.
I do think the idea of time is helpful because it's outside state that everyone agrees on. It's what it is.
That's
the
not
most
true.
part. Time is hard,
Not
but
everybody
yes,
agrees.
yes.
It is an
Not everyone
outside
agrees.
state, but not everybody agrees on it.
Not everyone
yes.
agrees. But generally, we have methods like NTP, right, for BMCs and for controllers and for things to generally agree on. So I'm thinking in the context of jobs, in the context of if you want to declare state, if you do have a last reboot time, you can have all kinds of rules around. Don't double reboot. Don't reboot unless unless it's after a certain amount of, don't do a power action unless it's a certain amount of a window around that time. That's been stated in a record. I mean, it really comes down to how do we want to architect Rufio, and I think like right now it's mostly controllers, right? Like whether that's doing jobs or state, and so deciding, do we want state to be the thing or jobs to be the thing? That to me is kind of where the decision is. And I do think it's probably worth whether like Chris, if you want to write it, or someone to write here's the pros and cons of both. here's kind of what we experimented with, here are the challenges.
And like, in theory, like the roughest use case for Rufio is as a way to get a machine to power, like you dump a bunch of stuff into Kubernetes and say like, hey, create this machine with a workflow and whatever. And also you want to say like, and the machine should be powered on to have Rufio power on the machine so that it can actually boot into Pixie boot and boot into Tinkworker and continue. Right.
I'll take an action item to
Um,
jot down notes on our experiences so far, and then that can just be a data point that we can use or information we can use going forwards.
I apologize. This was really good conversation. I feel like it did run just a bit. We do have other topics. So I don't want to stifle this. Please, let's definitely continue this. Maybe GitHub discussions or the Slack channel or something, or next meeting, please do bring this up. I think there's still a lot of good discussion to be had. But let's move on. If you don't mind, Nahum, you've got one about more BMC stuff.
Yeah. So just for awareness, Joel over here at Equinix Metal is working on improvements in BMC lib that are, I think, for the most part orthogonal to Tinkerbell, but Pull 280 is trying to figure out how to like do versioning in BMC lib land, and has potential implications for PB&J as a consumer of BMC lib, but also Rufio. So there's discussion there about like should we do V2 by branching, by creating a subdirectory, all that sort of stuff. Whatever the conclusion is, we'll have those implications. So I wanted to make sure that Chris is aware, Jacob, that you're aware that that PR is out there. There were some internal discussions on the versioning over here. I don't know. I'll double check and see if any of that ended up in the actual PR. But your thoughts on it are welcome, and your awareness and for whatever the final conclusions are in that PR will be important.
I'm creating a tracking issue for us in Rufio. I could do the same in PB&J actually, if you want.
If you're sure.
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks. Yeah, please do. Thanks, Nahum, for bringing that up. Please do check that PR out in the BMC lib repo and comment and contribute. Just in general, I think it'd be helpful for folks to voice their opinion on the versioning preference, et cetera there. Appreciate it.
That's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Nahum. All right, I had an item, repo role additions. I'm super excited to see lots of folks using the existing roles and requesting to be added to the roles. I did want to highlight just briefly that we do have requirements, and that as a maintainer or someone that has the role or the responsibility to approve these, please do enforce our requirements that we do have. If you don't like the requirements, please put a request in to change them, but we do have them. And so I posted 2 different pull requests where you can see the difference between 2 different requests. I apologize, one is from me, but one of them in the PR very explicitly defines how this person met the criteria, and the other one was just a request without any of that info. They both got merged, but I would make a plea to maintainers to please make it a little more transparent why this person made it in, not just, I don't know why these people deserved it, by the way, all of them, FYI. It would just be nice to have this record a little bit more explicit. So I just wanted to throw that out there real quick.
Are we able to, well, actually, what do people think about adding a right for maintainers to fast track people to the governance? There'd have to be a vote, but if maintainers, for example, because I think Jake is probably getting at me lately, because I fast tracked into CapT recently when I circled around with maintainers, which was it wasn't great. It wasn't following the governance, admittedly, and that's not right. I shouldn't have done that, but so Jacob's absolutely right in what he's saying, but it does make me wonder if is there a use case for adding a bullet point so maintainers can speak up and say, actually, we really value this person, we want to get them in as an approver or something, not necessarily all the way to maintainer, but as an approver. And do people think there's value in that, and is that sensible? Like, should we think about adding that into the governance?
I'll throw real quick. I apologize. I wasn't trying to point to you specifically, Chris. This happened actually twice to you and another person. So it was more about, I like the idea of fast tracking. I think getting people in quickly is fine. It's just the transparency on like, maybe why they are if we're following the governance. So then to go to your point, I think that seems reasonable. Putting a little bit of guidance around what fast tracking means and what would be required. Sure. I think we're early enough that this makes total sense, right? Like we're not a huge project. We don't want to have to wait months for somebody to make it through. I think that's pretty ridiculous. And not only that, but we can lower the bar, and we've already lowered the bar once, right? And there's no reason we can't keep lowering the bar. I just think we should just make it official, I guess, would be my thought.
The immediate thing that comes to my mind, and maybe someone was explicit about this, but I don't love the phrase of lowering the bar, but changing the requirements. And one of them could be that, like, if you've already hit the threshold of involvement in other repos within the project, that enables you to fast track into other repos. Like if you are a maintainer out of a 9 out of 10 repositories, and then like you want to be a maintainer of the 10th and you have yet to contribute to it at all, but like you have a single PR open that like refactors the whole thing beautifully, and everyone else is like, this is beautiful, like, and then you've changed 90% of the code, like maybe, you should immediately be a maintainer of it, right? Like you can imagine those sorts of scenarios. So thinking about, and it's possible that we could look back and say like, oh, how many repos was this person? Yeah, so as Micah said. So I'll stop talking about that. The other random thought I had was, if there's work in this, but do we have the ability to make a like a template for those sorts of requests, like the PR template, or like a PR template for like, I want to be a maintainer, and that includes like, here's the boilerplate, especially so that if someone doesn't use that you could like even just do like that, you could copy and paste the boilerplate into the description and say, please fill it out, and then we can complete it. Maybe having that I haven't looked at the government document just yet, but possibly even like just putting it in as a blurb inside the government's document, copy and paste this into your PR and whatever.
I think we had an initial member to become a member. There was a template possibly. I don't know if we have one per role, but yeah, that seems reasonable. I mean, these things don't change that often too. I wonder if
we could just copy and paste from existing ones as a first pass.
Sure, or just maintainers in general, please, just like that's got to be one of your responsibilities, is to make sure that this stuff happens in that way too.
You could do an issue template, and then like the issue template and use one of those issue templates that isn't just the raw markdown where you hand modify it, where it looks more like a form when you use their markup language for templates.
Yeah, it looks like here I'll post. We do have one for organization membership. So yeah, again, someone just has to put the time in to do it. One last thing I will show. I'd love to have more conversation about what the specifics on fast tracking or lateral movements mean. I think I do have a little bit of concern on certain lateral movements, because if you are a maintainer like myself, I'm in Boots and I feel like I have a pretty good handle on DHCP in general, but I don't know anything about Cloud Init. So being a maintainer immediately on Hegel doesn't seem reasonable. Now that's a very specific use case, but and it's not a very strongly held opinion I have, but it is a concern I would bring up, right? I don't know if just becoming a maintainer of one should open the door to all. Plus the other challenge is I would love to see more diversity of maintainers, and this might create a more stagnant maintainer group that would have, I don't know.
In general, I agree, and that's why I guess I was kind of suggesting there needs to be an element of discretion from existing maintainers because like, yeah, you can define the requirements and stuff, and that's fantastic for lateral movements. And I think to your point, there's some things that make sense, like maybe CapT to Rufio or Rufio to CapT, because it's all Kubernetes controllers, right? Maybe that makes
Right.
sense. But there are other things like CapT to hook. Well, that makes absolutely zero sense. So yeah, I think discretion is an element of the puzzle.
Agreed. Awesome. All right. Sorry, I'm going to close this one. Feel free to continue on Slack or GitHub discussions. Let's try and move on here. Chris, you got another one, test and test resources.
Yeah, do we have like, have we got written down anywhere like an inventory of test resources and what our expectations are, testing expectations are? It seems somewhat weak, and this was a last minute bullet point based on the conversation we just had where you were saying, I tried this and this worked, but that one didn't work. And I was just like, well, these just sound like reproducible test cases that we should probably model somewhere.
Yeah, for me, that was all manual. I don't know. I'm not aware of us having any explicit resources, although I know we'll get some, or what's the right word? We could potentially get some from the CNCF. They do have a relationship with Equinix Metal in terms of like accounts and things of that nature. So we could have these, but I don't know if that, I forget if we have to be incubating to get those. But at the moment, unless somebody else knows, I don't think we're doing any, what does GitHub call them? On-prem runners, or what are they called? The
self-hosted runners or whatever.
So I don't think we're doing any self-hosted runners. And I don't think we have any like, resources just kind of sitting out there doing any test scenarios or anything like that.
It might be useful to create a test repo and then get some end-to-end things with the entire system, doing kind of some of the stuff you were talking about and figuring out what that looks like with resources and whatnot.
Sure. I think Sandbox tried to do that at some point. That might be an interesting.
Self-hosted runners on Sandbox.
Oh, really?
It says they're none configured, but they're shared with the repository. So they're coming from somewhere. We have GitHub Action Runner 0, 1, and 2. They say organization self-hosted. There's an ARM, an x86, and the two x86s say Vagrant and Vagrant libvirt.
Oh yeah, I don't know if we use those workflows anymore, but yeah, that's a good point.
I interpreted Chris's question a different way of like, do we actually have code that if we had hardware that would run the actual tests? I think
that
we're
too.
also kind of missing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're also missing that. Yeah, it would be great to, at a minimum, be able to like on a PR to the Sandbox, be able to have something spin up a Sandbox and do an Ubuntu provision on a virtual machine and then like succeed and have that like run to completion or something like that.
Yeah, in the context of the roadmap to v1.0, I think it's reasonable to expect that a consumer would want you to demonstrate the system works end to end, even with a small suite of tests before releasing something. So yeah.
Cool. Is that reasonable for that topic, Chris, or was there more you kind of want to dive into?
No, I might just start a Slack thread to keep track of some stuff and chat, and it might be useful to start a pilot project in Sandbox to figure out the bits where that's existing stuff's coming from and what it might take to get more stuff in there and write some tests, even if it's just one test to start off with.
Sure.
Go from there, but I'll make a bullet point.
Awesome, thanks. And then you got one more there, Chris. You want to go again?
Oh yes, Amazon has an intern. And we talked previously about writing a Hegel metadata standard and maybe shifting toward that as the primary source eventually. Currently, it's just Equinix Metal, basically. There is no EC2. It kind of looks like EC2, but it's not EC2. So this intern is taking on the project of designing the API and whatnot. And what I'm encouraging them to do is come to this group and present it after publishing it, to get feedback around the minimal set of API endpoints that we would need. So you'll have an opportunity to feed into that. And yeah, we're going to get developing on that and make it a toggleable API to start off with, and maybe one day switch to that as the primary API. This enables things, just FYI, such as per instance actions, where an action, a Tinkerbell action, doesn't have a disk, for example, that is just statically configured. It's pulled from Hegel. So now you have the same template used across different machines, and the use case in consumers such as EKSA is we no longer have to enforce a bunch of constraints when provisioning Kubernetes clusters. So yeah, watch this space.
Nice. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Chris. I added one more item. Apologies there. Rufio pushes to Quay would be really awesome. If anybody has time, please help. I don't think we're pushing those.
That was updated.
Rufio?
Yeah. Oh, Rufio. What was it last time? Was it Rufio last time? You're asking?
The one you enabled that wasn't public, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Hook or something?
Tink controller.
Oh, okay. So Rufio is similar, just set that one up. Okay.
No, not similar. I don't think there's a GitHub action that actually does the push. So I don't think
Okay.
we're doing it. So that's just a call. If anybody has some cycles, that would be awesome. I'd love to just, so we could point to it, right? I think we're going to need it if we want to include it in things like Sandbox. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but we're going to need some public place to pull it down from, right? So if anybody has cycles, appreciate it.
The stub has been created, so now we just need the GitHub action. And I say that as I'm clicking button, so it's not quite ready yet, but in a second.
Step in Quay.
The
You mean there's a
repository in Quay will be
okay.
created, empty, ready
Oh,
for
perfect.
pushing. Yeah.
Awesome. Right on. All right, cool. Any other, we've got 7 minutes or so here. Any other topics or show and tell or discuss, just general discussion items? Anybody has? Any tickets or PRs folks want eyes on? Okay. No problem. If there is nothing else, thanks y'all for showing up. If you're watching this in the future, glad to have you as well. And we'll be in the Slack channel and in the GitHub repo. Next week at this time, we will be having triage party. Please do join us. No experience required. Thanks y'all. Have a great week.
Bye.
Take care.